911, what is your emergency?
We're at Blue Sea Sanctuary, the Orca show. Oh my God, she has her. The whale has the trainer. She's not letting go. Send someone now. Please, God.
Before the sirens wailed along the Santa Cruz cliffs, before the cheerful music of the show was ripped apart by screams, there was only the illusion of harmony, an illusion crafted over a decade, polished to a brilliant shine, and sold to the world for the price of a ticket. This is the story of that illusion shattering. This is the story of Elise Moreau, a woman who believed she spoke the language of the deep, and Kayla, the 17 Orca who would have the final word. To understand how a dream became a nightmare in the space of 120 seconds, you must first understand the woman at its center. Elise Moreau wasn't just a trainer, she was a true believer. Born in the coastal town of Saint-Malo, France, her childhood was a symphony of crashing waves and the cries of gulls. The ocean wasn't a backdrop for her, it was a living entity, a world of profound mystery she felt destined to enter. While other children were drawn to playgrounds, Elise was drawn to the tide pools, tracing the patterns of seaweed on wet sand and filling sketchbooks with impossibly graceful drawings of killer whales. To her, they weren't monsters of the sea, they were its soul, possessing an intelligence that she felt humanity had tragically underestimated. This conviction carried her across an ocean of her own. At 19, she left the cobblestone streets of Brittany for the sun-scorched concrete of a marine training facility in Florida. The work was anything but glamorous. Her days began before dawn, filled with the stench of thawed herring and the back-breaking labor of scrubbing algae from vast acrylic walls. She was quiet, observant, and possessed a patience that bordered on Senior trainers, accustomed to bravado and ego, took notice of the young French woman who seemed to communicate with the animals not through dominance, but through stillness. She could read the subtle shift of a dolphin's pectoral fin, the slight widening of a sea lion's eye, and understand it as a complex sentence. By the time she was 34, Elise Moreau was a star of Blue Sea Sanctuary, a marine park perched on the dramatic coastline of Northern California. She was the face of the park, her image plastered on billboards and brochures. Her signature show, Harmony of the Deep, was a masterclass in theatricality and perceived trust. But the real draw, the heart of it all, was a relationship with Kayla. Kayla was the park's matriarch, a behemoth of muscle and mind, and Elise was her devoted partner. Their bond was legendary within the industry. Colleagues watched in awe as Elise would forego the standard target pose and whistle, instead using soft vocalizations and gentle hand gestures to guide the massive predator through breathtaking maneuvers. "She doesn't command her," a fellow trainer once remarked to a journalist, she asks. To the public, it was proof of the impossible that the line between human and wild animal could be erased by love. But behind the shimmering blue water and the perfectly timed splashes, a darker story was being ignored. The story began not in a sunlit Californian pool, but in the brutal, icy waters of Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula in 1995. Kayla was unborn into this world of applause and reward. She was violently stolen from it. Her family, was ambushed by capture boats. The roar of engines replaced the songs of her kin. The vastness of the ocean was replaced by the suffocating confines of a net. She was just a juvenile when she was ripped from her mother's side, a memory seared into her DNA, a trauma that no amount of training could ever fully erase. Her early years in captivity were a testament to that trauma. Internal records, meticulously filed away and hidden from public view, painted a disturbing portrait. They detailed long stretches of lethargic non-compliance where she would sink to the bottom of her tank and refuse to move for hours. They noted aggressive food refusal, where she would let buckets of fish rot rather than perform a requested behavior. And then there was the incident in San Antonio. 3 years before she ever met Elise, a senior trainer, pushing her to learn a new trick, was met not with compliance, but with a sudden violent tail strike that shattered 3 of his ribs and left him with a lifelong fear of the water. The official report labeled it a trainer error. The incident was buried, and Kayla was sold to Blue Sea, marketed as a magnificent, if slightly temperamental, new asset. Elise knew of this history, but she saw it through the lens of her own unwavering belief. She saw a misunderstood soul, not a threat. She was convinced that Kayla's past aggression was a cry of loneliness, a pain that only she, through patience and empathy, could heal. And for a decade it seemed she was right. But in the final months leading up to June 12th, the cracks in the illusion began to show. They were small, almost imperceptible to the cheering crowds, but not to everyone. A junior trainer, James Lynn, had hesitantly approached Elise after a rehearsal 2 weeks prior. He'd noticed Kayla holding her body with a new rigidity, her jaw making subtle popping sounds, a well-known Orca sign of agitation. He mentioned that her responses to cues were delayed, that there was a coldness in her eye he'd never seen before. Elise had smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She is a complex emotional being, James. She's not a machine. She has off days just like we do. I know her." That was the sentence everyone at Blue Sea repeated like a mantra. Elise knows her. Her confidence was absolute. Her connection with the animal, the bedrock upon which the entire park's reputation was built. That unwavering trust was her greatest gift. It was also her fatal flaw. She had built a bridge to a wild heart, never once stopping to consider that the wild, by its very nature, can never truly be tamed. And as the sun began to climb in the sky on the morning of June 12th, that wild heart was beating with a rhythm no one, not even Elise, could understand. A rhythm that was counting down to the final performance. Part 2. The sun on June 12th rose over the Pacific with an oppressive white-hot intensity. It was the kind of heat that makes asphalt soft and the air thick, amplifying every sound and smell. At Bluesia's sanctuary, the day began like any other. The rhythmic hum of the massive filtration systems, a constant mechanical heartbeat, pulsed beneath the concrete walkways. The air carried a mixture of salt, chlorine, and the faint, sweet scent of popcorn already being prepared for the first wave of guests. It was a carefully manufactured paradise, designed for delight. But on this day, the cheerful facade felt thin, almost brittle. Elise Moreau arrived before anyone else on the training staff. It was her ritual, a quiet hour before the park gates swung open, a time she cherished for its stillness. She stood on the edge of the main performance pool, the water a placid, impossible blue, and watched as Keller's immense form glided silently beneath the surface. This morning, the Orca was different. She wasn't swimming her usual fluid laps. Instead, she remained in the center of the deep end, largely motionless, rising only for a slow, deliberate breath before sinking back into the blue shadow. To Elise, this was a sign of deep relaxation, of an animal so comfortable in its environment that it needed no nervous energy. She saw it as a state of meditation. She called down a soft greeting in French, her voice echoing slightly in the empty stadium. Keller's eye, a black, intelligent orb, rolled toward the sound for a moment, but her body remained still. Elise interpreted this as acknowledgement, a quiet good morning, between old friends. She failed to recognize it for what it was, the same lethargic non-compliance that had been documented in her file years ago. It wasn't calm, it was a withdrawal, a closing off. As the park staff trickled in, the manufactured energy began to build. Cheerful pop music was piped through the speaker system. Gates were unlocked, merchandise was stocked, and the first families, bright-eyed and laden with cameras, began to pour in. The noise level rose from a murmur to a roar. For Kayla, it was a daily acoustic assault. The world of an orca is one of sound, of clicks and calls that can travel for miles through the open ocean. In her concrete world, those sounds had nowhere to go. Her own sonar bounced back at her relentlessly, a disorienting echo. The squeals of children, the rumble of the sound system, the constant splash and chatter, it was an inescapable cacophony. On this particularly hot day, with the sun beating down and reflecting off the water's surface, the sensory overload was reaching a crescendo. Backstage, in the cool, dim prep area, Elise zipped up her wetsuit. It fit like a second skin, a uniform she had worn for a decade. Today's performance was special. It marked 10 years to the day since her first show with Kayla. The finale was planned to be their most ambitious yet, a move they called the ascent, where Kayla would lift Elise clean out of the water, balancing her on her rostrum for a full 10 seconds as they glided across the pool. It was a maneuver built on a decade of trust. James Lynn passed by, checking the deployment mechanisms for the emergency nets. "Everything looks good," he said, though his eyes lingered on the pool monitor, where Keller's still form was visible. "She seems quiet today. She's saving her energy for the big show," Elise replied with a wink, clipping on her headset microphone. "She knows it's a special day." But even as she said it, a flicker of something, not doubt, but perhaps a faint, unfamiliar curiosity passed through her. She pushed it aside. This was her partner. She knew her. To question that now, on this day, felt like a betrayal. The stadium was packed to capacity, a sold-out sea of over 800 faces shimmering in the heat haze. The announcer's voice boomed, hyping the crowd, introducing the star trainer and the gentle giant of the sea. As the underwater gate slid open with a low hydraulic groan, the music swelled. Elise walked to the edge of the stage, her smile brilliant, her arms outstretched in her signature welcome. Kayla swam into the performance pool, her dorsal fin cutting through the water. The crowd erupted, but her movements were sluggish, her lines not quite as sharp as usual. The opening sequence of synchronized spins felt a half-beat behind the music. A massive breach, usually a showstopper, lacked its explosive height. Elise, ever the professional, adapted seamlessly. Her voice, broadcast to the entire stadium, was a calm, reassuring melody. "Keller's feeling a little soulful today. Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, laughing. "She's making us all wait for the big finish." The show continued. Each command was met with a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation. It was a conversation where one party was no longer listening. The tension, invisible to the audience, was a palpable electric current to the trainers watching from the wings. They exchanged uneasy glances. On the radio, a spotter's voice was low, clipped. "Stage left, keep a close watch. Response time is lagging." It was time for the finale, the ascent. The music softened to a dramatic, anticipatory hum. Elise swam to the center of the pool, treading water, her eyes locked on Kayla. This was the moment of ultimate connection, the climax of their 10-year story. She gave the hand signal, a slow, graceful arc through the air. It was the cue Kayla had responded to thousands of times, the cue for her to dive deep, then rise up beneath Elise to begin the lift. But Kayla didn't dive. She floated on the surface, 30 feet away, watching. A hush fell over the crowd. Elise, treading water, held her smile, but it was strained now. She repeated the signal, adding a soft vocal command into her waterproof mic, a command only the Orca was meant to hear. Slowly, Kayla began to move, but her approach was all wrong. She didn't dip her head to position herself. She remained at the surface, her massive body gliding forward with an unnerving, deliberate speed. The angle was too shallow, too direct. The audience leaned forward, captivated, believing this was part of the dramatic build-up. But on the deck, James Lynn felt his blood run cold. He reached for the emergency alarm button. Elise, still in the water, saw the 7-ton predator closing the distance. She saw the change in posture, the slight flattening of the pectoral fins. The connection she had trusted for a decade was gone. In that final, frozen second, Elise Moreau looked into the eye of the animal she loved more than life itself, and for the first time, she saw a stranger looking back. Part 3. The impact wasn't a violent ramming. It was something far more terrifying in its precision. Keller's rostrum, a battering ram of solid bone and muscle, nudged Elise's side with a firm, deliberate pressure that knocked the air from her lungs and sent her stumbling backward in the water. For a single, surreal heartbeat, it could have been a mistake, a miscalculation in the choreography. The audience let out a collective, intrigued gasp. Elise's microphone picked up the sound of her sharp, involuntary intake of breath. Then, before she could regain her balance, Kayla opened her mouth. The water churned as her massive jaws, lined with dozens of conical teeth designed for tearing, clamped down on Elise's left forearm. The snap was not audible over the lingering music, but its effect was instantaneous and horrific. A scream, primal and filled with shocking agony, was ripped from Elise's throat, only to be choked off as Kayla violently dragged her beneath the surface. The perfectly blue water erupted in a chaotic froth of white bubbles and, a moment later, a plume of crimson. The illusion of harmony was not just broken, it was annihilated in a cloud of blood. On the deck, chaos erupted. James Lynn slammed the emergency alarm, and a strident, piercing siren cut through the stadium, finally silencing the show's music. The abrupt shift in sound sent a wave of panic through the crowd. What had been a captivating spectacle was now a scene of raw, predatory violence. Parents instinctively grabbed their children, shielding their eyes, but it was too late. Kayla burst from the water, the full length of her colossal body breaching in a spectacular, horrifying arc. Clenched in her jaws was the limp ragdoll form of Elise Moreau. She thrashed her head from side to side, shaking the trainer with bone-shattering force in full view of 800 helpless spectators. Shouts echoed from the trainers on deck. "Kayla, gate! Gate!" they screamed, slapping the water, throwing buckets of fish and brightly colored buoys in a desperate attempt to distract her, to break the fatal fixation. But the Orca was deaf to their commands. Her world had shrunk to the confines of the pool and the struggling figure in her mouth. She was no longer a performer. She was an apex predator acting on an impulse that had been suppressed for 2 decades. She dragged Elise under again, pulling her deep into the blue twilight of the tank. Elise's world was a maelstrom of pain and pressure. Her arm felt like it was being ground to dust, and her lungs burned for air. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to get free. But against the power of a 7-ton animal, her struggles were futile. She broke the surface one last time, gasping, her face ashen white, her eyes wide with a terror that no one there would ever forget. She made eye contact with James on the deck, her mouth forming a word that was lost in the chaos, but her expression was unmistakable, a plea. Before anyone could react, Kayla pulled her back under. This time, the attack changed. It became more methodical, more brutal. The Orca released her arm only to grab her by the torso, spinning her in a disorienting underwater vortex. Then came the ramming. Kayla drove her body into the concrete wall of the pool, the impact resonating as a dull, sickening thud that could be felt through the stadium's foundations. Emergency protocols were failing. The main separation net, designed for exactly this scenario, snagged on a railing as 2 frantic trainers tried to deploy it, rendering it useless. The secondary gate to the medical pool wouldn't respond to the remote command, its mechanism jammed by the sudden panic. The entire system, built to project an image of safety and control, was collapsing as quickly as Elise's body. The attack lasted for less than 2 minutes, but for those who watched, it stretched into an eternity. Finally, as if a switch had been flipped, Kayla stopped. She released her hold. Elise's body floated to the surface, face down, motionless. Her brightly colored wetsuit was torn and shredded, and a dark halo of blood spread slowly around her in the now still water. The stadium fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The only sounds were the distant wail of approaching sirens, the soft lapping of water against the pool's edge, and the uncontrolled sobbing of a single child in the stands. Kayla drifted to the far side of the tank, her body still, her breathing slow and even. She watched as paramedics and trainers finally reached the edge, using a long hook to gently guide Elise's lifeless form to the side. They pulled her from the water, a broken figure laid out on the pristine white deck. The vibrant blue of the pool, The bright yellow of the rescue equipment and the deep spreading red on the concrete formed a tableau of unspeakable tragedy. A trainer, a former paramedic, immediately began chest compressions, but his movements were mechanical, hopeless. He knew, everyone knew, Elise Moreau was gone. Part for the silence that followed the attack was a heavy, suffocating blanket. As Elise's body was covered with a stark white sheet on the side of the pool, a quiet order was given over the radio. Evacuate now. Security personnel moved through the stands, their faces grim, guiding the stunned and weeping spectators out of the stadium. They left in a trance-like procession, dropping programs and half-empty drinks, their faces pale with the horror they had just witnessed. They had come for entertainment, for a magical glimpse into the bond between human and beast. They left as unwilling witnesses to a brutal killing. The cheerful music of the show forever replaced in their memories by the sound of alarms and the sight of water turning red. Within the hour, Bluesia Sanctuary was no longer a park. It was a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire stadium. Investigators from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration (OSHA) arrived, their mandate clinical and clear to determine how a workplace had become a place of death. They were followed by state animal welfare officials and marine biologists, each trying to make sense of the carnage from their own perspective. The initial statement from Bluesia was brief and sterile, expressing deep heartbreak over the tragic accident and promising full cooperation, but behind the scenes, a dam of carefully constructed secrecy was about to burst. As investigators seized internal records, a narrative of systemic negligence began to emerge. The buried incident report from San Antonio detailing the trainer with the broken ribs was unearthed. Years of behavioral logs documenting Keller's jaw-popping, her aggressive lunges, and her periods of deep withdrawal were brought into the light. Most damning were the internal emails between park executives. One, sent just 6 months before the attack, dismissed a senior trainer's concerns about Keller's increasing agitation. Elise has it under control. The park director wrote, "Her connection is our brand. We cannot afford to pull them from the show. Monitor the situation but do not escalate." The truth was clear. The warning signs had not just been missed. They had been willfully ignored in the service of profit. The coroner's report laid out the brutal facts with dispassionate, medical precision. The official cause of death was listed as drowning and blunt force trauma. The autopsy detailed a catalogue of catastrophic injuries: a crushed rib cage, a punctured lung, multiple fractures, and a left arm that was, in the coroner's words, effectively severed. The report concluded that even if she had not drowned, the internal injuries were so severe that survival would have been impossible. Elise Moreau had not simply been killed. She had been dismantled. The emotional fallout was immense. Her parents, flown in from France, were a portrait of shattered dignity, demanding not revenge, but answers. They released pages from Elise's personal journal, and in her elegant script, the world read of her final weeks. She had noted Keller's strange behavior, writing of a sadness in the Orca's eyes. In one haunting final entry, written just 2 nights before she died, she wrote, "There is a distance between us I have never felt before. It is as if she is listening to a song from a world I cannot hear. I must try harder to reach her. If I can't reach her, maybe no one can." For her colleagues, grief was mixed with a heavy dose of guilt. James Lynn's testimony to OSHA was devastating. A quiet, broken account of every concern he had raised, and every time he had been reassured that Elise knows her. Public outrage was a firestorm. The image of the smiling trainer and her majestic wail was replaced by the stark reality of captivity. Vigils were held, protests erupted, and the hashtag #FreeKaela trended globally. Elise Moreau became a martyr, a symbol of a beautiful lie. The betrayal, people realized, was not from the animal, but from the system that had caged it, commodified its spirit, and sold a dangerous fantasy. And what of Kayla? She was retired from performing and moved to a back pool, isolated from the other orcas. She swam in slow, endless circles, a 7-ton ghost in a concrete tomb. The debate raged over what to do with her. Some called for her to be euthanized, others for her to be moved to a seaside sanctuary. But she was too valuable as an asset and too institutionalized to survive in the wild. She was, and would remain, a prisoner. Elise Moreau's legacy was not the one she intended, but it was powerful. Her death became the primary catalyst for the Orca Protection Act in California, a landmark bill that banned captive orca breeding and performance shows. She had dreamed of building a bridge between 2 species, of proving that love and understanding could conquer instinct. But her story serves as a terrifying and permanent reminder that nature, in its truest form, is not ours to control, to script, or to tame. A wild heart, no matter how long it is held captive, will always remember the call of the deep. And when that instinct finally surfaces, it shatters our most cherished illusions, leaving behind only the hard, undeniable truth in the silent, blood-stained water.